to Remainders. I'm your host, Darren Burrell.
And I'm your co-host, Patrick McIntyre.
We will explore the stories from our conscious collection of music, books, and film.
The ones that have shaped our lives.
Join us as we take a closer look at what remains.
Welcome to Remainders, where we share better living through stories. My name is Patrick.
And I'm Darren.
This week we are covering one of our personal favorite films of all time, one that goes way back to our old school days at the video store. We are going to be talking about Point Break. Point Break is the action thriller of the 90s, I'd say, both revered and reviled as a staple of 90s action films. It oozes a machismo theme throughout, with both Keanu Reeves, Patrick Swayze, and even Gary Busey all vying for who is the manliest man around. But this movie was directed by Kathryn Bigelow, who had already established herself as a talented genre director, and would go on to an astounding acclaim with the contemporary war dramas Zero Dark 30 and The Hurt Locker, the latter of which earned her a Best Director Oscar. Bigelow remains to be the only woman ever to receive an Oscar for Best Director. So two questions remained in my mind the entire time watching Point Break this time around. One, how did it take a woman to direct some of the most genuine and successful films about men of all time? And two, since the release of Point Break in 1991, filmmaking is still mostly a man's game. But are the movies closer to giving women a full seat at the table now? What do you think?
I think so. I think the way that the world has changed in just the last 3 to 4 years has been remarkable. And I'm glad to see it happen. Even podcasts that I listen to, I think I've talked to you about my favorite podcast, You Must Remember This, had just done an entire series on Polly Platt and how she was just a remarkable woman in her field and what she was doing, but had to take a little bit of a second seat. I mean, not a little bit, a second seat to Peter Bogdanovich, who was her husband at the time. I'm not going to give anything away. If you will listen to the podcast, you'll see that she really was responsible for so much of the success that happened in not only the movies and not only the men in her life. They were able to take credit for a lot of that, and that's something that's a shame. And I'm glad we're going to be able to talk about Kathryn Bigelow here. And there's pioneers like Bigelow who are able to really set the stage for a lot of things that are happening in film now. And even TCM just this last month had done a whole expose on women in film. I don't know how else to say it. You never saw that stuff happening before. Criterion constantly champion women filmmakers. So I definitely think things are changing, way overdue. And as you mentioned, this movie oozing with machismo, right? Isn't that what you said?
Absolutely.
And some of the times, I didn't even realize as a kid. Well, it's almost like we should talk about that. Like, it's those two dudes with their shirts off half the time. What's going on with this whole surfer thing that like entire generation of guys love this film, but it's also looked at as kind of campy. There's so much going on in this that I never really thought about. Why do I like this? And Patrick Swayze, just such a badass. Keanu Reeves, sort of a newcomer. Look at Keanu Reeves working probably the year after. Gosh, I wish I knew this for sure. But My Own Private Idaho, doing that movie. And he had Point Break going on. I think they said that Ghost was already filmed and coming out in theaters for Patrick Swayze at the time. I mean, there's so much going on in this time period. And guys out there, listeners, all we're asking is 90 seconds of your life. Or actually probably like an hour.
I think that's a great segue. I think a great way to get into the film is a question to you as a friend. How excited were you to watch this again?
Oh my God, man. So, I figured since I've seen this like 30 frickin' times in my life, as you set it up in the beginning so well, I have watched this so many times. And look, it's not the greatest movie ever made, certainly for some acting in here with Keanu Reeves. I don't think he's the greatest in this film. I don't necessarily think that a movie about surfing that I would really relate to. But again, I love it. I love this movie, and I can't put my finger on it. Maybe by the end of our discussion, we'll figure it out, because obviously I'm not the only one. So many people talk about this movie. They even did a remake in 2015. Did you see it? I didn't see it.
Nope, I missed it. Was not very interested and did not hear anything good about it. So it's barely a movie that exists, I feel. So
Swayze and Keanu Reeves and Gary Busey, Lori Petty. Seeing Lori Petty in anything like A League of Their Own, which I love, by the way. Another women director there, Penny Marshall. But going into like Orange is the New Black and watching that, seeing Lori Petty, I always thought, oh, I love you so much because of your being in Point Break.
No, she is kind of the glue in this movie for multiple reasons. We'll definitely get into it. I think it's largely because Bigelow is such a talented action director, but also she brings the feminist characters into it. So Tyler, Lori Petty's character, we get introduced to her because she saves Keanu Reeves. And it's not in like a cheesy way. It's like Keanu Reeves is a person who's like just learning to surf. He's with the FBI and he's going to learn to surf. He sets up to infiltrate the surf scene to find the bank robbers. He's really shitty at the surfing. The surfing is dangerous, obviously. He's about to die, but then that's when Petty comes in and saves him. He's shot in a way where he's completely helpless. He's choking. He's spitting up water. And it's clear he wasn't going to cut it or even make it out alive with the help of Petty.
That's a great place to talk about this quote that I read that Keanu had said about his character. He said, Johnny Utah was a total control freak, and the ocean beats him up and challenges him. After a while, everything becomes a game. He becomes as immoral as any criminal, and he loses the difference between right and wrong. Now, that was from what I've read, that was Keanu Reeves' statement on that character. Now, I think that might be like a little more dramatic than it actually was for that character. It's like a little more deep than it needed to be for that character. But I do love the fact that, yeah, he does look a little... he's a football player doing this job because he blew out his knee and never got to do the grand scale NFL career that he could have had. So now that he's checking up surfing and everything, it's all pretty new to him. But again, as we're getting into the story of it, he meets a bunch of surfers to try to figure out who's robbing banks in Los Angeles area. And we realize at some point it's Patrick Swayze and his band of ex-presidents who are, from the looks of things, surfers because they only rob banks in the summertime when the surf is good. What a crazy idea for a movie, but that's it, and it's great.
Yeah, I love it. Well, let's back up. Keanu Reeves gets promoted to bank robbery department for the FBI. He gets saddled with the straight edge group. I love the quote. He's like, "We're straight edge here. We don't drink, we don't smoke." And his response is, "I take the skin off chicken, sir." I love it. Yeah. And then shortly after, that's when he gets saddled with the great Gary Busey. And I think this is a perfect touch of Busey in terms of like he's kind of like that middle road for Busey, which is still laughing maniacally, jumping into pools, yelling and screaming about his 22 years on the force, but it never jumps into the territory of too campy. I think it's a perfect amount of Busey. Angelo Pappas,
and his character is it's Gary Busey. It's almost like you're seeing Cary Grant in a movie. When you watch the movie, you got Cary Grant every time you saw him on the screen. When you watch a movie with Gary Busey, you're getting Gary Busey in every movie, even when he plays Buddy Holly, in my opinion.
The best.
He's just so crazy, so cool. I have a good story about him in Malibu. My friend Tom was driving, and I think Gary Busey is a Malibu resident, and he pulled up next to him, who he thought it was Gary Busey, and he's like staring, right? He's like, whoever's in the passenger seat, he's like, "That's Gary Busey. That's got to be Gary Busey." And he said Gary Busey was looking at the other direction and turned around and gave him the biggest, craziest smile with a cigar in his mouth, basically knowing everyone was checking him out. And he was like, "I am Gary Busey,"
He's relishing in his infamy.
Right. That's a great thing about like a rock star or whatever. The more crazy stories are about you, or the more your reputation builds like that, like the bigger the legend you're going to become.
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. Busey is the one who brings in the idea, as you said, of suggesting the ex-presidents are a gang of surfers. Reagan, LBJ, Nixon, and Carter. And it's kind of at that scene at the drop car when they're yelling at each other. It's like the movie's already displaying like who's got the bigger dick between the two. Bigelow makes it clear that the movie is about tough men doing tough things in this one. That scene when they're yelling at each other at the drop car is absolute perfection, I think.
There's some great cameos in here. with Anthony Kiedis. And I have to think, because Anthony Kiedis, I think, is a Malibu resident as well. And I know some of this was filmed there. So I kind of wonder if like just sort of the Malibu crew was like around and they knew the area. I just kind of wonder that because, like I said before, Gary Busey, I think, lives there. And kind of interesting, Kiedis has a great role. I mean, just out there, drug addict, surfer, territorial. He has that would be a waste of time. Wants to beat up Keanu Reeves.
Well, I love that's how the romance between Keanu and Swayze starts. It's the way they really connect fully and kind of start to really trust each other is by beating the shit out of Anthony Kiedis.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, and I don't think we've ever put it that way before, but I'm glad you did.
I mean, in terms of the story, that's absolutely. So he gets introduced to Patrick Swayze through Tyler. His name is Bodhi, the Bodhisattva, real searcher. It's basically the Buddhist term for a person who is able to reach nirvana, but delays doing so out of compassion in order to save suffering beings. And that's kind of like what I love about the theme of this movie is that kind of Buddhist tone that kind of like permeates the entire story. It's kind of similar to the quote that you brought in earlier. That's why I think it's applicable. And later there's a part when Swayze he gives a speech on like why they're basically robbing banks and living the life they do. As he goes into critiquing the corporate lifestyle, inching along the freeway, proving that the spirit of life is still inside them as long as they are still alive. And that's kind of like how he sees the surfing and the bank robbing, is like proving to people that the spirit of at least my life is not dead yet.
Yeah, it's almost kind of like there's no rules except for his rules, too. And it's almost like he's got a band of people that believe in it. Of course, as we find out through the end of the movie, people suffer a price for that belief system. But you're right, Bodhi is enlightened one, right? And I know, Pat, you have a lot of knowledge of Buddhism as far as books you've read and maybe the way that you live your life. You had mentioned before we decided to do this podcast that you're like, man, I watched Point Break again recently, and I didn't realize how much like this is a very Buddhist kind of Zen way that a lot of characters have that in them. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I mean, I guess it's really more anecdotal for this one. He calls him Bodhi. He likes to surf and he likes to live the middle way of life where he's not, in his own speech, he's not brought down by the corporate lifestyle. I think it's really more like just, it's not even subtext. It's just like on the surface level stuff that kind of makes his character kind of interesting and gives it that tone. And that's kind of why I think Keanu, who's much more strict with his own way of life, that's just kind of like how they learn from each other. I don't think it goes much deeper into that other than that. So, like
everything else in this movie, it doesn't really go as deep as you think. If you want to go deeper, it's like, it's probably on the surface. It's fine.
Yeah, and that's why I think it works so well. So they beat the shit out of Anthony Kiedis. Keanu is actually led to suspecting that Kiedis' gang are the ex-presidents. He thinks it's them. And so this leads to a raid, which is just another part. Like during the raid, the cops bust in and there's a woman taking a shower. And Keanu, assuming he's able to address this woman, he gets laid the fuck out by this naked woman. And it's not even a competition. She just wails on him, leaves him for dead. And he's really only alive because she basically chose not to kill him. And so it's kind of like why I like Keanu as a character in this story. It's like a machismo movie, but like he's constantly being saved and getting laid out by women. And I think that's kind of like a clear decision on Bigelow's part in terms of like showing this is not like an even playing field in terms of like men always conquering everything.
It is a lot of girls kind of hanging out with the boys. When you see Lori Petty, it's always kind of that way. And even what a shitty way to get into her life. Keanu Reeves' character decides to look her up, and he sees that her parents had died in a plane crash, so he makes up a story that his parents died in a car wreck so that he can find some kind of common ground with her. That story is like so age old and how women have been treated for so long. Like, I'm going to find a way to manipulate this situation and connect with somebody on a fucked up level like that to try to like maneuver your way into getting what you want out of a woman.
Yeah. By the way, what the fuck was that information doing on her police report? It's like you have police report showing your parking tickets or whatever you got charged for, And then right below that, oh, your parents were killed in a plane crash. Why would that?
Yeah.
Why the fuck would that be on a police report? I don't get it.
100%. And also, think about the scene. I watched this at 6 a.m. this morning, by the way, because that's how crazy my schedule has been. I was like, I can fit in Point Break at 6 a.m. Plus, I've seen this movie like 30 times, so I knew that I could be half asleep and watch it. I would still know it by heart.
Yeah.
How about that scene where that's happening and he's pulling up all the stuff? He's like, oh, yeah, what can I do to infiltrate this woman's life? And the operator who's pulling up all the information is like, ooh, she's good, Utah. Oh, yeah. Nice work, Utah. Like, what was that? You know what I mean?
Just antagonizing and getting a little push from his coworkers, I guess.
This movie, I didn't know this, was released in theaters, grossing $8.5 million on its opening weekend, behind only Kathryn Bigelow's ex-husband's movie, Terminator 2: Judgment Day. Did you know that?
I knew they came out the same year. Yeah, so I knew they were at least in competition for each other. And we'll get into a little bit more later on how they remain in competition with each other later in their careers.
I heard also that James Cameron had taken some writing credits for this movie. Did you hear that as well?
I wasn't sure how much he had a role in it. He was a co-writer on one of her later films, Strange Days, which is a great movie from '95. It bombed hard, so unfortunately didn't do much for her career. It's a great movie about fear of technology that was pretty strong in the mid-'90s, and he was the co-writer. I think he might have actually been the lead writer on that. And unfortunately, that's kind of like why she struggled to carve out her own name and get the full recognition for all her work. It's because she was consistently kind of like in the shadow of Cameron. And so I think a lot of people, like you just said, kind of look at this movie, they're like, yeah, that's also kind of Cameron's, because he is an executive producer. There's
some scenes here that are shot at night, especially after the party at Bodie's house, and they decide to go for a nighttime, like of course, anybody after drinking and smoking weed and, doing drugs, well, good idea is we should all go out on the water at midnight and, by the light of the moon, go surfing. So they do. And I got to tell you, she must have really thought hard about how these scenes were going to go, because those are beautiful scenes. They really are photographed beautifully.
No, a lot of this movie is gorgeous. Yeah, so they do the nighttime scene. It's quickly after that Keanu discovers that Bodie and his gang, that they are the ex-presidents. It's only after that do they commit to the ultimate form of male bonding. They skydive together.
Yeah, I was going to mention that scene too, because it's so weird the way it happens. Like, they all know everybody. They know Johnny Utah is a cop, and he knows that they're the ex-presidents, and they go over to Johnny Utah's house, and they're like, you know what, time to go, like really rattle him up to say, let's get out and let's go, we're going to go skydive, it's going to blow your mind, man,
yeah.
And they get up there and they skydive. On this watch, it was kind of amazing to watch that up in the air and within these adrenaline things or the chaos and whatever is happening, there is a grounding of everybody's character, because in the sky they even get together and grab hands and make a circle, a unity circle. But that's already at the time where, like I mentioned, they all know who each other are. There's like a respect for everybody, and in the air when they're doing that, they're yelling, "This is fucking amazing," and like it's almost like there was nobody got killed, nobody shot anybody, nobody robbed any banks. It was like, no, you're in it for the adrenaline moment, and nothing else matters. And maybe that was done on purpose. I
certainly subscribe to that. Swayze is out skydiving, and they have the camera following him all the way down. And it's just really cool. It's like it's something you don't really see in action movies now. It's like that would absolutely be all CGI background now, where it's like this is clearly like a shot where she was like actually in the plane shooting it, and then up to the point where they actually jump out, and then that's filmed all the way down. Great action scene, I think.
So for the listener out there, there's a scene which is wonderfully shot. It really is, and you have to see it for this. It's almost like a little bit puts you in the perspective of Keanu and going after Bodie after they find out that they're on a stakeout, Keanu and Gary Busey's character, and that's the famous Utah get me too. I'm hungry enough to eat the ass end out of a rhino. So forever, by the way, I always thought it was I'm hungry enough to eat the ass end out of a rhino, but I didn't realize he adds the word dead rhino, which makes it even more fucking insane.
Yeah.
I'm hungry enough to eat the ass end out of a dead rhino. So he's having Utah, get me two of those sandwiches. And as Utah's getting the 2 meatball sandwiches, the ex-presidents come and they're robbing the bank. And all of a sudden he comes back to the car, gives the 2 meatball sandwiches, and lo and behold, they had just missed their window to see the ex-presidents go in and rob. So anyway, long story short, they chase him down. And as soon as they get to a gas station, there's this amazing scene where Swayze's in the Reagan mask and he's hosing down to make sure there's no evidence in the car. He's got the gas pump, and it's probably not even possible to do because you'd probably blow up. But he's shooting the gas out, and it's like a flamethrower.
Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, and anyway, as that happens, Pappas comes around the corner and shoots out the window. So the rest of the ex-presidents leave Bodie, and that starts the scene where Keanu is chasing. And that was a long way to get to how they filmed it. But it is very L.A. as far as what you see, people's houses, and it's connected. They seem very close. There's these like brick walls, and there's the Rottweiler, not the Rottweiler, but the pit bull that's in the backyard that he grabs and throws on Keanu.
Which is amazing, by the way. That shot is just out of... Where else do you see somebody using a pit bull as a weapon? At least throwing as a weapon.
There's like a lot of amazing kick scenes. The first one was when you were talking about the naked lady. She like kicks Keanu so hard with like her naked foot in that scene you talked about earlier. But Keanu kicks the fucking pit bull. I don't know if you ever remember that. He kicks it and you hear it go.
You do kind of see it. It's inferred that he kicks it. You don't see it straight on.
Right.
Yeah. It's you're like, come on, Keanu. You threw a dog.
Like, how could you kick a pit bull that was that big?
Right.
Like and it looks like he kicked it and like punted the dog.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that scene just, I don't mean to diminish it by a joke about kicking a dog because it's shot beautifully. She deserves so much credit for those whole scenes and whoever else was involved.
No doubt. Picture the scene of Ferris Bueller when he's running through the house at the end, but only well done.
Like on crack,
yeah,
but like organized crack,
yeah.
Like you're able to contain yourself. Yeah.
Swayze and the ex-presidents, they take Tyler hostage now that they know... Everybody knows who's who. They take Tyler hostage. They force Keanu to rob a bank with them. And then, lo and behold, skydive again with them. And this is when their friendship, their bromance, however you want to call it, is truly being challenged, I think, at this point.
Interesting the way that like they share this relationship with Tyler. Like it's almost like she's this pawn in the game. Man, she never loved me the way she loves you, but it's like still kind of diminishes her importance because she was had by both of these men. Did you kind of get that?
Yeah, I could see that. There's another reason why it kind of works so well as a story.
Speaking of one of our episodes of Remainders, did you know that Willem Dafoe had turned down the character of Johnny Utah?
I did not know that. They had worked together previously. Her first film was The Loveless from 1982, starring Willem Dafoe. But yeah, I did not know that he was originally the character for this one.
Well, they said in the 80s this was going to be made at one point.
That would make sense then.
And it looks like that Johnny Depp was up for the role, and one of the people that were also, supposedly up for it was Willem Dafoe. Would have been an interesting movie with him. And also I heard that Swayze had read for Johnny Utah first, and then ended up getting Bodie.
Yeah, I could see that. Well, one thing I realized watching this time around was how much that Fast and the Furious is like a beat-for-beat remake of Point Break. It's like almost every single beat. The undercover cop, him trying to get in with the girl of the group, developing the friendship with the lead surfer or the car racer and Vin Diesel's character in that one, and then the bank heist / or drug running as a way to fund their high life. It's honestly like a complete remake of Point Break, which is just another reason why, we'll get into it, Bigelow has been so influential on the action genre for like 30 years now.
Interesting you like those movies, yeah? I mean, they obviously made a franchise out of that.
The later ones, when they add Kurt Russell, I'll support those, but Yeah. Very,
All right.
very loose recommendation of those. Yeah. It's those later ones where they actually become a little bit more self-aware. They stop trying to be like, we're legit action movies, and they start being like, we're big, dumb, fun movies. And then that's when Kurt Russell comes in, and it kind of works later in those. But, tepid recommendation for those. There's
a scene when they're coming down on the... you pull the ripcord. It's like again, another dick contest between Bodhi and Swayze, and it's like, no, man, you pull it. You pull the ripcord. And he's like, no, after you, Alphonse. And I don't know if you caught that. Like, I was thinking today, why call him Alphonse, I'm like, what the hell does that come from? So I looked it up. After you, Alphonse is a quote from the 1930s comic strip, Alphonse and Gaston.
Oh.
It's an American comic strip by Frederick Burr Opper, featuring a bumbling pair of Frenchmen with a penchant for politeness. Where did that come from? I would love to sit down with Kathryn Bigelow and be like, did you love that comic strip, or did somebody in your family love it? Because it was a choice to call Bodhi Alphonse when they're twirling to their death, debating whether or not someone was going to pull the ripcord.
I want to talk about Kathryn Bigelow a little bit more because this movie is so fucking great.
Yeah.
Just to give a little background on her, she's originally from California, graduated from San Francisco Art Institute, and she started working as a painter in New York. That's how she was originally getting into her profession. She was actually a successful real estate investor with the composer Philip Glass even before she started her way into movies, which I thought was crazy. She had already become successful on her own before she even started into films. And one of the running themes of all of her movies are the direct inner conflict with the main characters, who are usually men. I mentioned The Loveless earlier. So that was her debut feature with Willem Dafoe. It's definitely worth watching. You haven't seen it?
No, I have not.
Yeah, it's you could see it's a clear talent in her first debut. Dafoe is a tough, violent punk rock motorcycle criminal, but the movie itself is constantly challenging gender norms as something she does throughout her entire career. And Dafoe's character has some feminine traits in addition to being a violent psychopath. So it's definitely recommended. Big one is Near Dark. You've seen this.
Of course.
Yeah. So Near Dark, for anybody who hasn't seen it, how do you say it? It rules.
Yeah.
It's basically a Western, a horror Western. And this was kind of when she started collaborating with James Cameron for the first time. It's a vampire movie. It has many current vampire and horror tropes that we see now, but Bigelow was kind of the one who solidified it. I watched Blue Steel the other night for the first time, and it's bananas. Jamie Lee Curtis is a rookie cop in New York, and she ends up shooting somebody during a holdup. Ron Silver witnesses this, steals her gun, and ends up stalking her. Becomes this psychopath who basically fetishizes the idea of murder, and especially the idea of women with guns and the power that holds. She ends up being stalked by him. It basically turns into a horror film with Silver being an unstoppable killing machine like Michael Myers or something. Bigelow called this a woman's action film at the time. It's been studied in feminist classes since then, and it's definitely a classic that I think it may eventually emerge as one of her more influential films after a while, because it still doesn't have too much of an audience, but it definitely deserves that.
Wow.
Yeah. And so...
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a fantastic one. I mentioned Strange Days in '95. That's a great one. And then she kind of had a few flops, but then that's what led up to The Hurt Locker in 2008. The Hurt Locker is probably one of the more well-known films for our listeners, set in the Iraq War about a squad of bomb detectors working in Iraq. It avoids the politics of war and only really focuses on the inner conflict of the characters, specifically Jeremy Renner. Again, it's a movie that explores male conflict along with the physical aggression and mental challenges that are unique to males. And so I think this is where it really comes into her own. It's this is when she won an Oscar for Best Director, when she's still the only woman to ever do so. So she marries James Cameron about the time of Blue Steel in 1989, and she ends up divorcing James Cameron shortly after Terminator 2 and Point Break both come out in 1991. So they basically have a 2-year marriage where they're working full-time probably on these two pivotal films that ended up coming out the same year, and as you mentioned, competing against each other. And that kind of sets the tone for when they later rematch for the Best Director category in 2008.
Yeah, what was your thought, by the way, of James Cameron's movie that year?
Avatar?
Yeah.
My question for you is, what do you think about the fact that James Cameron is making 4 more Avatar films?
It's terrible.
Well, okay, wait. Well, let's get into
Avatar,
this.
fine, like visually cool, whatever. At the time, I'm just, I don't know.
Let's get into this. So I support Avatar. I get the critiques and kind of why it was like people thought it was kind of like a basic story and it was a lot of show and less substance. But I think it's actually a pretty great movie. But as I said, we're getting 4 more Avatar movies. I personally didn't think I needed to see any more Avatar movies. But I will say, if James Cameron tells me I need 4 more Avatar movies, then I must need 4 more Avatar movies.
Guy, look, he's done a lot of great things, and I especially love his work after Titanic was out. Like a lot of his work in telling the story of Titanic and restoring, making sure that part of history doesn't go away. He's very involved in that, and I love that kind of stuff that he's championed, I guess.
But you're not down with Avatar, though, so...
No, and I don't understand that. I don't understand why people like it.
You don't have to. I mean, you don't have to sound down. You're in good company with people who don't care, who give a shit about that movie. So
well, half the time too, when it's like movies like that, I want to like them. That's the problem. Is like I really want to like them, but for whatever reason, I just can't get on board with it. I saw it in the theater, and I thought it was fine, but it's forgettable to me.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. Have you seen it since the theater?
No, I have not. So.
I mean, I think with a lot less baggage now, I bet if you watched it, you would have far more appreciation for it than you did at the time.
Maybe. I've got a lot of other great movies to watch, so why go back to that one?
No doubt.
And let's just put it back into context. The Hurt Locker was an excellent movie. Way better than Avatar.
It wasn't even...
Definitely different. But, if we're talking about Kathryn Bigelow and James Cameron and the awards season, I mean, The Hurt Locker was it for me.
I mean, I was worried that Cameron was going to win. I was worried that he was going to beat her out because I think it was pretty clear that one of the two of them were going to win at the time. And I remember, the Academy already loves Cameron. At the time, no women had ever won the Oscar. Only 5 women have been nominated for Best Directing. You have Lana Wertmüller in 1977. 1977 was the first time that a woman was ever nominated for Best Director of a film.
Man, Star Wars Annie Hall year, yeah?
Yeah. Jane Campion in 94. The third was Sofia Coppola for Lost in Translation in 2004. And then that led up to Bigelow winning. She was the 4th woman nominated, and she was the first woman to ever win at the time. And then since then, it's only been Greta Gerwig for Lady Bird in 2018. So there's only 5 women who have ever been even nominated for the Best Directing Oscar. And this kind of goes into her career and kind of like how she's reacted to that. She doesn't consider herself a, quote, woman filmmaker. She considers herself a filmmaker. She's intent on normalizing a world where more women are filmmakers. There's just a great quote. It's her saying, "If there's a specific resistance to women making movies, I just choose to ignore that as an obstacle. It's irrelevant who directed a film. The important thing is that you either respond to it or you don't. There should be more women directing. I think there's just not the awareness that it's really possible. It is." And I think that sets...
So it's almost sort of like, hey, no matter who directs this, make sure that you do a good job because your job is to tell the story, right?
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be about the color of your skin, the gender, or anything like that. I mean, I like that. I think the issue, Pat, at least in the world, is that men have taken advantage of women. So I think a lot of women feel like they need to at least make their voice heard because it's not a fair playing ground, and men have made it that way.
Are you speaking societally or specifically just to films right now?
Well, I'm just speaking in terms of a woman being in that director's chair. There's a lot more awareness, especially in the older days, talking about Hedy Lamarr and her influence on Bluetooth. And then there's a lot more about Ida Lupino and her work as a director. But before... I don't know, Harvey Weinstein and things like that, nobody really talked about that. Nobody really had talked about pioneering women in the film genre. Like, again, the Polly Platt stuff that I was just talking about earlier. I didn't know any of that stuff. But it took, I think, the world to say, wait a minute, there are a lot of women in the past and currently doing great work. And so while I love Kathryn Bigelow's response that you just read, I love her response about, being a woman filmmaker. I think the argument for a lot of women filmmakers who feel like it is their duty to make it known that they are a woman in that role creating films, because it's so easy to be dismissed for a woman in that role.
Yeah, no doubt.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. That's a great point. So Zero Dark 30, another contemporary modern warfare classic. That movie's fantastic. Jessica Chastain. It was just a continuation of that kind of like almost documentary style of The Hurt Locker. And that really kind of solidified her. I mean, I think The Hurt Locker did, but even more so with Zero Dark 30 is solidified her as an absolute essential action filmmaker who has a unique voice and a unique style and is an absolute talent at the top of her game.
Going back today and talking about Point Break, which is a movie that we grew up loving, I can definitely tell you that it's shot beautifully and that it's a great movie as far as like not really making you think too hard about the story. But it's not necessarily thought of as a great movie, yet it's part of her story of directing and the movies she made to get to stuff like The Hurt Locker and Zero Dark 30. And I think it's important that we're talking about it now in terms of her, and that it's not just us sitting in a movie store making quotes that Keanu Reeves and Patrick Swayze and, the rest of the cast had said, because they're so easy to roll off the tongue and it's so cult classic. The real reason that we're talking about this is because of Kathryn Bigelow.
The movie looks completely different when you view it as a singular piece, and then when you view it as a piece in a line in her body of work. And I think that's what it just elevates it that much more. The campiness is still there, but again, it's the stories of the inner conflict, especially of the male inner conflict that continues, especially with The Hurt Locker, and is what made her so talented.
And I didn't know, you've kind of mentioned the themes in her films of sort of male characters being the dominant part of the conflict between each other, sort of leading the story. And it definitely is apparent here in Point Break.
Well, it's pretty even. Like when you look at her career and all the movies, it's the ones that are about the males that have gotten traditionally more attention. The Hurt Locker, Point Break, all these movies that are often pointed as like the essential films about the inner struggle of males and that experience. But then at the same time, she's made these essential films, like I mentioned, Blue Steel, which again, I think is going to become like an essential film that is recognized for its depiction of strong female characters. And then, as I mentioned, Zero Dark 30. So she does balance herself. It's just for obvious reasons, the ones that are starring males get a little bit more attention. And it's also just interesting that she's so good at depicting the male characters. It almost takes like an outsider to create something so unique and original. Quick question, what other filmmakers have mainstream and critical success along with name recognition? Women filmmakers.
Ava DuVernay is starting to be...
That's what I have. Yeah. Like I have a couple that I thought of, but you realize that there are so few equivalents to like a Scorsese or a Tarantino. I mean, I think of Bigelow. Bigelow is kind of who comes to my mind first. Greta Gerwig, even though she's only made 2 and she's already made like a strong mark. Sofia Coppola, Ava DuVernay, and maybe Penny Marshall.
Yeah, for sure. Penny Marshall. I mean, I mentioned her earlier when we were talking about A League of Their Own.
Yeah. And it just kind of makes
I think she also directed Big, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, she rocks. I mean, I love it. But again, it's kind of like you realize how it's still a man's game, filmmaking.
Yeah, you're right when you say, if you're going to put it in terms of like, okay, we revere Scorsese. Okay, one, yes, he's great, man or woman. He's a great filmmaker, and he champions film, and he loves the craft. And it doesn't matter if he's a man or a woman, except for it does matter, because we're not talking about a woman that way. We're talking about Martin Scorsese. Martin Scorsese at least doesn't seem to be rivaled by any woman in the world right now of film, at least the way it's talked about in our society, right? That's kind of your point.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to put it.
I mean, I just want to stop for a second and say it doesn't need to just be the director's role, you know? There's so many people behind the scenes that make these movies work. And I think that that's another area, at least in my limited knowledge of this, where a lot of people working in film don't get enough credit.
Yeah, totally.
There's a lot of casting directors. I mean, think about, we just talked about Martin Scorsese, and I think this is why this came up. But I mean, Thelma Schoonmaker, I believe is her last name. How do you say it? She's edited all of Martin Scorsese movies, I believe, late 70s till now. And she's a woman. I definitely think she's a little more well-known than most female editors, but definitely she's a woman working with a man to make great films. And I think there's a lot of good collaboration. So it's not just about the director that we're talking about. Set design, things like that.
Yeah.
All are better by all genders working and creating a great film.
Love it.
So in our story, it really culminates where Patrick Swayze needs an out. He needs to know that Johnny Utah is not going to arrest him. They go on, they do this whole skydive thing, but his insurance policy, as he calls it, is kidnapping Lori Petty, Tyler, and making sure that, hey, something's going to happen to her if something happens to me. And so, of course, this puts Johnny Utah, Keanu Reeves, in a tough position because he loves Lori Petty, and he knows he's got to take down the Bodhisattva. As they land and Patrick Swayze says, hey, your knee blew out again. That's that damn football injury again. And Keanu Reeves is like, oh, no. Keanu just can't get up to get him. And so Swayze says, well, we both lose this game. But he does get to leave. And we don't really know where he's going, but he does release Lori Petty. Seemingly, that's the end of our story until the 50-year storm.
I love this 50-year storm.
I mean, what a great thing. It's like, yo, you're going to be at the 50-year storm. I'm going to go there at the right place at the right time, and you're going to be standing there waiting to take your set in. And this is how the movie ends.
He walks up in the rain, and Bodhi, in a beautiful shot, is just eyes closed, just staring. You see him from like 100 feet away. He's just staring out at the ocean and what he's about to accomplish for himself. I love it.
Yeah, and he's kind of got like his little poncho on. And you know what? There is something, again, I don't know how deep I want to get. I almost say this with a wink in it. But he's got his hair cut like kind of Johnny. Did you notice it? Are you really?
No,
I'm looking at Pat right now, and he's like saying, whoa, I noticed this. I'm surprised.
No, they switch haircuts. Keanu.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Keanu grows it out. Swayze's short. This is an absolute clear. I mean, it's so obvious that like this is what they learned from each other. Not the haircuts, but this is how they've coming into each other's lives and how they've affected each other. And it's like they're learning from each other. But Bodhi is obviously he didn't get enough. You know, this is where he's at now, and he still has to bring him down though.
Well, there's this idea that Johnny Utah does need to get his man. And he wasn't going to stop until he found him. So he says, I came across an unclaimed piece of meat, and Baja turned out to be Rosie. Everyone you come across dies. You gotta go down. And it's like, that's what I would say to Pat. Every day I would walk into like Suncoast. He would be sitting behind the counter selling DVDs, and I would just do my terrible Keanu Reeves impersonation of this scene. This scene we're talking about right now. And it's so freaking awesome.
For listeners, Darren has been doing that monologue for 20 plus years, no doubt. So
yeah, I love it, man. I'm so glad I get to do it again. It's like it almost made my pandemic here saying that to you again.
Absolutely.
One of the coolest things is that they're like gonna battle it out. It's not gonna be easy, but you don't realize he's coming with an arsenal. I mean, Johnny Utah knows he's going to find him there, and he does. He's going to take him down, but this time he's got all of the SWAT teams and the helicopters, and Bodhi's kind of like, come on, man. Come on, compadre. Like, you know I'm not going to paddle to New Zealand, you know. Let me go get one more. Let me get one more wave. But at this point, Johnny Utah knows he's not coming back in, is he, Pat?
No, he really accepts his own fate with being caught from Keanu. And it really all just leads up to I can't handle a cage. So they both kind of know the fate of him, no doubt, at that moment.
Right. you know I can't handle a cage, man. Let me get one more set. That ends the film with the classic, I'm not a cop anymore, rogue Johnny Utah throwing his badge into the water, badass, and it's like, doom, 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 shot. You know, it's like a big like guitar riff going on at the end of that. And it's just like everything you want at the end of that movie.
That was one of your musical influences when you were a kid, right? You know, that end guitar riff, right?
Oh, 100%, dude. I was like, I need to be the guy who writes music like this.
You know what? I think I'm going to pick up a guitar after watching that.
I mean, that's kind of the thing is like that end scene by like him, like even the way Keanu talks, like, you gotta go down, you know, just being like that kind of badass, even though it's campy, like makes you like it, like makes you love the movie. And again, we've talked so much on this podcast about movies that are super influential, that changed our lives, that make us live a certain different way. It's okay sometimes just to say like, there's really not too much substance to this movie. It just kicks fucking ass. Yeah,
but then when you put it into context of Bigelow's career, it elevates it to a whole nother level.
And, you know, I got to tell you, just watching it, being really sad that Patrick Swayze is no longer on this earth. I think people took him for granted, man. You think about his career. Tu Wong Fu, you got Donnie Darko for sure, where it's like just genius. And even Roadhouse and all those movies, like those 80s, fucking Patrick Swayze, good for you. Ghost, killing it in that. And Keanu Reeves, too. That's the other thing I think that, especially this movie, he got pigeonholed as this dumb guy, but man, is he a cool guy. From everything I've read about him and just like his way of approaching life in his own personal life. And then also, like I said, My Own Private Idaho, which I think he's excellent in. Not necessarily a huge fan of the Matrix films, but I can understand how great he is in those. You know, I think he's a cool actor. I definitely think this movie, people kind of pigeonholed him as like a little bit of like a bad act. Even like Speed, dude. Speed's pretty kick-ass.
Well, yeah, so this was 91, so this is in the era of Bill and Ted, and then shortly before Speed, so this is certainly when he was kind of viewed as like the dopey California bad actor, but obviously, looking back at it now, he's become much more respected, even though he kind of still makes similar B movies. And I think it largely has to do with his persona, you know, the amount of obstacles that he's overcome in his life. He's always been very upfront about that. And it's not an easy thing to be tagged with, but like usually when people talk about like the nicest people in Hollywood, the nicest actors in Hollywood, it's usually Tom Hanks and Keanu Reeves. Those are the two names that always get thrown out there.
That's just something to say about those two actors, as those two guys working together. I mean, that's something to be celebrated just right there.
Yeah. No doubt. And we have Bigelow to thank for that. And that kind of largely has to do with why we wanted to talk about this movie, and kind of what I personally was taken away from is giving credit where credit's due. And I think Bigelow is legit responsible for so many of the current styles in big budget action films right now, especially action films, I should say. 3 points to that with Near Dark, the genre mashing up of horror and Western. That combination hadn't really been done. And looking back, like the combination of the two, thinking of like Shaun of the Dead, something darker like Deadwood, or even Bone Tomahawk, which I believe you're a fan of now.
Oh, yeah.
These are all movies that can be kind of traced back to Near Dark. Point two, you have Point Break. Led to all these cheesy action films of the 90s. As we mentioned, Fast and Furious. And Point Break is still one of the best, I'd say. And then the third point is with Hurt Locker and Zero Dark 30, she had an absolute monopoly on how like modern war movies have been made, especially about the Iraq War, especially on how modern war movies are made. Those movies are certainly some of the most respected and critically applauded, especially for its visual style and cohesion. And these are all things that you can legit trace back to Kathryn Bigelow. I would be comfortable saying one of the better directors working today.
Wow, that was awesome, man. I loved hearing you talk about that. Definitely grateful to have her work and us to be able to, like, it's connected us. I would venture to say that this movie has connected us in our friendship. I don't think there's ever a time I really see you where we don't talk about Point Break. I mean, really. Isn't it true? Isn't that true? Like in some fashion, whether it's me doing some kind of stupid, like, you gotta go down, or like, that kind of stuff, something comes out of it every time we see each other.
No matter how serious our conversations have gotten, and we've had some deep conversations, we still manage to reference Point Break. That's true.
That's true. I'm not sure if you have anything else to say. I could talk about the scenes. I could quote them. I literally do know most of this dialogue front to back.
I can attest to that, listeners. He is not lying.
Yeah, maybe we've said our piece, though, specifically on Kathryn Bigelow, which I think was the most important part. So, and I want to thank you. You had some really great things to say about her. I want to go back, and something I can take away now. I hadn't seen The Hurt Locker since it came out. I'd love to go back and watch that now after this great discussion. And these other films that you talked about that I hadn't seen of hers. And I hope that our listeners do the same, because she is definitely a very important filmmaker out there making movies still to this day. That's perfect, man. I fully support that. All right, Pat, as we are signing off on our discussion on Point Break, which I'm glad we did because it made me laugh in this whole series. I think you need a little laughter mixed in with the serious things that we talk about. But as we leave here today, I just want to make sure that you remember to never, ever go to the vault. Never the vault. That's when people start dying. Have a good night. Thanks, everyone. You have been listening to Remainders. This episode was written, narrated, and produced by Darren Burrell and Patrick McIntyre. Original music, episode art, logo, and editing by Darren Burrell. Find out what else remains by visiting our website at remainderspod.com. And we're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Just search @RemainersPod. Please tell anyone you can about our show, and we look forward to telling you more of what remains next time.